Welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I am Nagma. Joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will be looking at some of the global leaders and their reactions in dealing with the pandemic. We still see that a lot of countries are still struggling to cope up with economic measures to come out of their lockdowns. But at the same time, we see that the global leaders like America and China are continuously engaged in a kind of war with each other. The escalation is continuing. The fight over the virus is continuing between America and China. We see Trump tweeting, we see Trump threatening, and at the same time, we see a very aggressive China. So what does this all really mean? We also see almost India and China almost in a face-off situation on the borders, and a very aggressive Nepal as well. So on this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will try and look at all these issues and analyze this. Professor Harsh Pant is here with me. Thank you for joining, Harsh. And I want to, it's the same old story, Trump threatening, Trump tweeting, but I want to begin with the latest tweet of President Trump where he is saying he wants Biden to become the president so that it can continue to rip off America the way it has always done till the time Trump came in. Like, this is what Trump says. He's been hitting China over its handling of the coronavirus, but we now see that the White House has now issued a very broad-based attack. It has said that economic practices, also, military build-up, misinformation campaign, all of this. So, do you think this thing about get tough rhetoric that Trump seems to be propagating, the get tough with China rhetoric, will it resonate?
I think so. I think this is primarily looking at his, election campaign. And what has happened is that some of the poll numbers that have emerged, which put him behind Mr. Biden, perhaps have annoyed him a bit. And in the process of responding to that, he's trying to bring the two, which is China and Joe Biden. And I think by linking them up together, he is responding to some demands from his base, which is about, who is the enemy here and how do you respond to that? So if you can link Mr. Biden to China, if you can link that somehow, if you can make a case that somehow China is behind Joe Biden and that somehow China does not want Mr. Trump to be the next president because Mr. Trump has used strong arm tactics vis-a-vis China, and the Democrats have traditionally been seen as weak on China. I think that might rally his base around him, and that's what he seems to be hoping. And this is also very interesting because, in some ways, even the Democrats a few weeks back had gone back and said Mr. Trump actually is weak on China. His response in the initial phase of the pandemic, where he was congratulating Chinese president, showed that he was completely out of his depth when it came to China and how China was manipulating information. So I think clearly the stage is set for China becoming a very, very important player in the electoral campaign. And both Trump and Joe Biden would use China to up the ante and to make their own case to the voters. The question is whose pitch will the voters buy and how effective that pitch would be at a time when domestic challenges that America is facing continue to rise by the day.
But Harsh, do you really think Trump has been successful in a way making China a scapegoat or basically blaming everything that's gone wrong, just putting the blame on China? Has he been successful in doing that? Because both Xi and Trump seek to win over the domestic constituencies, looking for someone to blame for all their problems.
I think to a certain extent, as far as his hardcore base is concerned, I think they are happy that he has taken, over the last 3 years since he has been president, 4 years now, he has used strong tactics vis-a-vis China. He has managed to put China on the mat. He can reasonably claim that he has generated a global consensus against China. He can reasonably claim that China's declining rates of growth, for example, might be a function of some of the policies of his administration, and that he has ratcheted up pressure on China at a number of levels, especially on trade and technology. But I think the larger issue here is how effective that would be in broadening his base, which I think is the problem that he faces. His core base remains intact and has been with him through thick and thin. I think the question now is whether going forward, as he wants to expand that base to take on Joe Biden, what perhaps he can do to attract them. And can he make that claim that China and Joe Biden perhaps are linked somehow, allows him to do that? I very much doubt that, but I think that's the strategy that he seems to be following in the short term at least.
And if we actually we look at what's China doing in Hong Kong, so it's moved to impose the national security law in Hong Kong, and in a way, the US has reacted very strongly. US had also passed a legislation last year wherein it can again impose sanctions on China if China undermines Hong Kong's autonomy. But we see there is a division in the US Congress. Do you think Trump will actually, other than the threats, will actually take some strong measures to stop China there, or can Trump take those measures? The reaction otherwise from other countries from the world has been rather muted on Hong Kong.
Yes, I think it has been quite unfortunate as far as Hong Kong is concerned, and this is something that we have seen over the last year as well, when the protests were at their peak and when the crisis in Hong Kong was getting even more difficult for Beijing to handle. Even then, there was not the kind of support that you would expect for a democratic movement in Hong Kong, and Hong Kongers, frankly, were left on their own devices by the world community at large. Trump administration made some noises. They made some headlines. They said that they would be supporting Hong Kongers in their fight, and they would like to put limits on Chinese behavior. But evidently, on the ground, operationally, they could not do much. At the moment, also, it seems that apart from rhetoric, there is very little that they can do, given the circumstances. And I think, in particular, what we are witnessing now is China might be becoming its own enemy in some ways, because it is doing a number of things which perhaps a lot of the countries would interpret as growing aggression from Chinese side at a time when clearly world has different priorities. So if you look at Hong Kong, for example, from Beijing's perspective, they needed this law because of what had happened last year. But, they are using this as an opportunity where most of the countries are involved elsewhere in their own domestic affairs to push through a legislation which will change the very constitutionality of Hong Kong and the way one country, two systems platform was inaugurated in 1997 when the British handed over the charge to the Chinese. So now I think the reality for the Hong Kongers might be that they will have to fight it on their own, given that the world has other priorities, and also that, in some ways, given their past experience, I don't think they'll be very hopeful that they would get much out of the world community on this particular front.
Okay. So they won't get really much out of the world community there, though there have been a lot of threats from America that America can react very strongly. And if we look at, the China National Congress is on, and a lot of decisions were taken. But one of the things is that the defense budget, though did not show the growth like it was last year, but there has been growth for the 5th consecutive year. The defense budget is growing. And it is still 3 times that of India. Now, we see that China is engaged in many hotly contested territories, whether it is in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. So, like you rightly said, right now, while the priority is different in different countries, China's aggression is on the rise. And we see it everywhere, whether it is Hong Kong, whether it is concerning Taiwan, Vietnam. So, wherever, what is the message that China is really trying to give right now? Certainly, it looks like its concern or its problems are not how to manage its own people or to create employment. It is, projecting itself as a global leader, because American leadership has been missing anyways. So this aggression of China, how do you assess this?
Well, it's quite interesting. And on the one hand, what they've done is, for the first time since 1990s, they are not giving, they're not producing, giving the world a target of their economic growth next year. So clearly, at some level, that they are worried domestically. that the domestic demand has collapsed because of coronavirus, and the global demand has collapsed also because of the same reason. So the global economy is in doldrums, and their Chinese economy is in doldrums, both as a result of what is happening globally and what is happening domestically. So they are concerned domestically what might happen. Their economic woes are increasing, unemployment is rising, and the basic contract that the Chinese Communist Party has with its people, that they would, they would continue to fester economic growth, they would continue to foster economic growth, while people would not demand more freedoms, political freedoms from them. I think that might come under some stress going forward. That might be the fear in some quarters in the top echelons of the Chinese Communist Party. But I think, on the other hand, for Xi Jinping, it is very important to continue to assert this claim that he is going to take China to new heights, as he has promised. He is going to make China a world leader by 2025, as he has promised. So clearly for him, the issue is very important that he continues to invest in certain strategic sectors. Now, defense, as you mentioned, is a very important sector for them because, as again we have been discussing, if you see the use of military instrumentality in Chinese behavior in recent months, it's quite extraordinary. World is preoccupied with something else. Really, China will therefore continue to invest. Yes, investment in defense is going to be less than in the past. They are saying it's 6.6, excuse me, 6.6% less than the previous year. But the question is, do we believe those numbers? In the past also, we have seen, for example, independent assessments last year suggested that where China was claiming a defense budget of around 178 billion, independent assessors were saying it's around 230 billion. So clearly, I think the lack of transparency in the Chinese model has created a paradox where China wants to give out some numbers, wants to give out some information, but no one in the world believes those numbers. So this information this disinformation campaign, in some ways, which China is also uses with its data, continues to bedevil its engagement with the wider world. But the message that is coming out is very clear, that China would continue to invest in defense. It will invest in strategic areas, strategic technologies, and it will make sure that its centrality of military as an instrument in its foreign policy will continue to grow.
So I don't know how to look at this. Maybe you could give a short comment on this. Has there been a change in the Chinese economic thinking? Because for the first time during the National Congress, we saw that there was no economic target that was set, which is always the case. And for the first time, the priority was probably in creating and stabilizing.
Yes, I think that's, they are not giving out these numbers for the first time since 1990s, partly because I think they are not sure where the economy might be headed. And given that they are also dependent on the global economy is still, we are not yet in the post-COVID-19 phase. They are still in the COVID-19 phase. We are still struggling with that. So I think they recognize the challenge. And also I think by not giving themselves a target, they also give themselves some flexibility to room to maneuver. So if, for example, they are not able to produce the kind of employment figures that they want, they can easily manipulate some of the numbers here and there. They can easily use some of the other economic instrumentalities that are available to them to make sure that some certain demands can be created and domestic demand can perhaps alleviate some of the problems. So I think they are giving themselves this flexibility by not giving themselves a target, but it also shows the concerns that are there in the top echelons of the Communist Party in China, that things are not going well in the economic dimension and they will have to be extra cautious.
Yeah, like you've just said that China seems to be focused on emerging as a more powerful world leader at a time when the priority is clearly different for most of the countries. But that we recently saw on the borders near the Pangong Lake and in Sikkim, China-India face-off. America has warned India that China is getting very aggressive and it could be a situation like in the South China Sea. But we also see recently that Nepal grew very aggressive, and we see, in a way, a Nepalese cartographic aggression, changes in the map. And KP Oli's speech in the parliament was very, very strong. So what are the factors that have led to a change in the approach of Nepal towards India? Because, the Lipo Lake and Kalapani disputes have been there, but the relationships were very cordial. Or if we look at the recent speech in Parliament of the Prime Minister, the tone seems to be very different.
Yes, I find it quite extraordinary for a Nepalese Prime Minister to be using the kind of language which I think it was quite unnecessary, frankly, because you know that this problem dates back to the historical past. You know that there have been problems, and problems from both sides. It's not as if it's entirely India's fault. Nepalese themselves have also been at fault in terms of how they have not really shown a political will in terms of moving forward with this with the solution to this problem. So there have been problems on both sides on this question. Both sides understand each other's dilemmas and sort of sensitivities. And the issue has been that that could have been articulated in a manner that that does not take the discourse down. Instead, Mr. Kohli resorted to some language, to a kind of a language that was completely unnecessary, frankly. And by doing that, he has also sort of underlined a theme which many in India have been worried about. That look, perhaps there is some degree of coordination, if not collusion, happening between the Chinese aggression on the border and the Nepalese behavior. Now when it comes to India and Nepal, oftentimes we tend to overdo the China factor. China is an important factor, but clearly our ties with Nepal, as many in India call it, roti and beti. It's level interactions that happen every day. It's an open border. I mean, those ties cannot be compared, frankly, with any other country. And any two countries in the world, I don't think, share the kind of relationship that India and Nepal share. So I think when Mr. Oli talks about these issues in a manner that India perhaps is more of a worry than China is, and this and that, it complicates that matter, and it aggravates the feeling in India that perhaps he's trying to coordinate it with what Chinese are doing at the border. And of course, we know that in recent months, Chinese backroom diplomacy in Nepal has been very, very aggressive. China was responsible for making sure that the Nepalese Communist Party does not split. Chinese ambassador to Nepal was playing the role behind the scenes in making sure that this does not happen. And Mr. Kohli's historical ties with India have not been that complementary. We have had tensions in the past as well. But whatever the past may be holding, it is a reality also that Indian government, especially Mr. Modi, has been quite open. His outreach to Nepal had been quite substantive. So to make this issue the center point at a time when we know that the region needs a coordinated response to a health crisis seems quite befuddling. But I'm sure, there are various reasons, as I'm alluding to. There is domestic political reason. For example, one can look at Mr. Oli's own popularity ratings in Nepal going down, and nationalism vis-a-vis India serves well. And also the fact that, if there are multiple pressure points on India's border, perhaps India might look at the Nepalese problem much more benevolently. That might also be the reason behind it. But whatever the reason was, I think it could have been articulated in a manner that leads us to a more amicable solution rather than more tension.
So these strong statements from Nepal were certainly uncalled for, like you say. And we've seen with most of the leaders that there are domestic compulsions. Similarly in the case of Mr. Oli too, but we clearly see a China hand there. So Chinese footprint everywhere in a way, and the increased aggression we're seeing while the rest of the world is still battling with easing out and coming out of the lockdown and revamping their economies. So thank you so much for that discussion, for that analysis, Harsh. And that's it for this episode of Ideas Factory from us.